G'day, Ancient Party. Many people have asked me on live streams, in sessions, people have emailed, what is the difference between borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder? And why are so many mental health professionals diagnosing, largely probably psychiatrists, mixing these up and getting them so incorrect one to the other, whichever would be most appropriate or fit somebody, whether they have bipolar 1 or 2, or borderline personality disorder. Well, there's some symptom overlap, not enough to have them be this mixed up this often, and especially by professionals. What's going on with that? Let's get into it. Let's look at the difference between borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. And let's also consider the fact that perhaps it is more of a laziness, or in the US, an insurance thing, why one gets diagnosed versus the other. And really, accuracy is important, even though with BPD they say it's a personality disorder, a trauma-based response, they pathologize it. But nonetheless, let's start with the symptoms of each. Symptoms of borderline personality disorder. They include uncertainty about one's role in the future, who one really is, what one feels, what one wants to do. Frequently changing interests and values, yes, because people don't know who they are. A tendency to view things as either all good or all bad, yes, black and white thinking. The all good or all bad, all or nothing proposition of a split way of thinking, which is often derived or comes from splitting, which comes from triggers, which comes from past unresolved trauma. People with BPD can change opinions about others quickly, perceiving someone as a friend one day and an enemy the next, or a friend one morning and an enemy later that afternoon. With BPD, there's a pattern of unstable, intense relationships with family or friends or even co-workers or anybody. People's feelings with BPD can alternate between closeness, what some people describe as love, which isn't really healthy adult mature love, to hate or anger. People with borderline personality disorder are unstable, distorted self-image or sense of self. Attempts to avoid real or imagined sources of abandonment. Stopping communication with someone in anticipation of them cutting off ties, or, in other words, abandoning, or what feels like to a person with BPD, abandoning them. People with borderline personality disorder, not all, but most, or more than not, self-harming behaviors. People with BPD have difficulty trusting people, sometimes because of irrational fear of their intentions, sometimes because they might experience expecting the worst from people, which is really a trauma-based response from how they've been hurt in the past. But feelings of dissociation, so they can feel unreal, they can have a sense of being cut off from one's own body, and seeing oneself from the outside of the body. So depersonalization, derealization, and of course, like I said, feelings of dissociation. For many with BPD, there's recurring thoughts of wanting to take their lives, impulsive or reckless behavior, drug misuse, risky sex, reckless driving, impulsive spending, intense episodes of depression, anger, and anxiety. People with BPD, some, not all, will describe and experience chronic feelings of emptiness. And again, some, not all, will have a fear of being alone. And it's really important to note that not everybody with or who gets diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is not a life sentence, by the way, can be recovered from, but not everybody has all of the symptoms that I just named. And some people may have only a few minor symptoms, while others experience severe and frequent symptoms. And approximately 10% of people diagnosed with BPD tend to have that very severely. Stressful or emotional events can trigger some of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. To other people, these events may appear minor or disproportionate to the response that they generate in those with BPD. But people with BPD have a highly sensitive temperament, it's been described. And people with BPD tend to misperceive a lot of things, taking things personally and feeling slighted and or attacked at every turn when that's not what other people mean at all. So there's discrepancy between not only someone's intent, but how somebody is being with someone with BPD and how the person misperceives what that's all about. Symptoms of bipolar. Well, people with bipolar disorder can experience extreme mood swings. Often people will alternate between highs, mania, and lows, which is depression. One key difference to note between BPD and bipolar is that in between the mania and the depression, if they're on medication, which is recommended and has efficacy for bipolar, unlike there's no such thing as a medication that has efficacy for borderline personality disorder, then in between mania or depression, there's a stable mood, and so that's very different from those with BPD. They still experience a lot of instability of mood that shifts very quickly. So some of the most common symptoms of mania in bipolar include extremely elevated mood, reduced need for sleep, an exaggerated sense of confidence and optimism, racing speech, thoughts, or both, reckless or impulsive behaviors, grandiose ideas, inflated sense of self-importance, irritability or aggression, poor judgment, hallucinations and delusions in severe cases. And then the symptoms of bipolar depression include constant fatigue, feelings of worthlessness and guilt, an inability to concentrate or make simple decisions, unexplained aches and pains, prolonged periods of sadness, unexplained crying spells, significant changes in sleep patterns and appetite, irritability, anger, or perhaps agitation, an indifference and often pessimism, excessive anxiety or worry, inability to find pleasure in things that were interesting prior or that brought about pleasure in the past. People with bipolar in a really depressed state often withdraw socially, and they can have thoughts of taking their lives. But not everyone with bipolar will experience depression. In fact, experiencing a manic episode is the only requirement for a bipolar 1 disorder diagnosis. People with bipolar 2 can experience the symptoms of depressive episodes, but they have hypomania, which is a less severe form of mania. Manic episodes usually last for at least 7 days, and they can sometimes be so severe that hospitalization is necessary. Depressive episodes often persist for at least 2 weeks, but often longer than that. Some people have rapid cycling bipolar disorder and experience 4 or more mood episodes within a year. But contrast that with people with borderline personality disorder. They could experience several different moods over the course of a day, over the course of a week, over the course of a month. So it is quite a difference there. When you think about borderline personality disorder versus bipolar disorder, well, BPD is a type of, yes, as a psychiatrist says, a personality disorder rather than a trauma response, which it really is, but it causes people to feel, think, relate, and behave differently than people without the condition. Okay, sure, yeah. But the reason is a trauma response, not necessarily a personality disorder, which used to be called characterological disorder, etc. Bipolar disorder is a type of mood disorder, which is a category of illnesses that can cause severe mood changes. People with borderline personality disorder experience an ongoing cycle of varying self-image, moods, and behaviors. These patterns typically cause issues that affect a person's life and relationships and the way in which they understand and relate to others. So maybe they don't understand themselves at all, is often the case, unless they get significant treatment. And bipolar disorder affects a person's mood, energy, thoughts, activity levels, and functionality in cycles that can last for days to months, sometimes even longer than that. And it's more common, they think, than borderline personality disorder. Bipolar and borderline personality disorder are confused often, apparently because they have such similar symptoms. Well, Not really, if you think about it. Or if you think there's similar symptoms, it's easier to just parse them by the differences. So some of the similar symptoms are intense emotional responses, depression, and impulsive behavior. But certainly leaves out hypomania or mania. That's a vast difference. People with borderline personality disorder do not have mania or hypomania. And they are two separate diagnoses, and it's important that, I don't know, it seems it's important that not only people know that, but it's important that maybe the diagnosing professionals who can't figure it out learn how to figure it out. I'm not saying some people couldn't have both, but it just seems like it's increasingly more and more people, and that doesn't really seem to make sense. So it's hard to understand for a lot of people, and apparently a lot of psychiatrists diagnosing this, that the difference between bipolar, as I said, and borderline personality disorder. And it's important to know those differences, and you'd think that clinicians would. Oh, it needs to be said, too, that life is turbulent. We all have challenges in life, and changing moods is often just a natural response to changing circumstance, different experiences, and stressful situations. But, so there's something called normal changing moods due to circumstances or feelings or stress. But for some, mood shifts are so extreme. They can be a sign of either borderline personality disorder in this case or bipolar. And they're both characterized by, in part, by major mood swings. But this partial similarity in mood shifts, going from an extremely high mood to a very low mood, causes many people, including many clinicians, to confuse the two disorders. And yet, the two disorders, they are two very distinct and serious diagnoses with different symptoms that require different methods of treatment. So there's something that really stands apart too. They need to be treated differently. Both illnesses affect millions of Americans. Bipolar disorder is estimated to affect 2.8%, or roughly 6.5 million adults. That's just in the U.S. Prevalence of borderline personality disorder is estimated to range from 1.6 to 5.9%, just in America, so that's not around the world. So how do you know if someone that you love, or you yourself perhaps, suffer from one of these disorders? And how can you tell the difference? This is the question. This is the issue. Borderline personality disorder, again, people with borderline personality disorder have extremely intense emotions that can shift rapidly from a negative depressed state to an elated one, but with a predominance of negative feeling states. With BPD or in BPD, the extreme and intense mood swings are often precipitated by reactions to events. So triggers, in other words. They go back to something in the past, unresolved, and that I would suggest are evidence of a trauma-based response. And they're disproportionate reactions or responses to events in the here and now, which somebody else might just take in stride. And other people get very confused, by the way. A lot of people with BPD really, seemingly overreact to things, and it confuses other people. So borderline personality disorder is also characterized by rejection sensitivity, chaotic relationships, and just an overall difficulty managing emotions. And also, fear of abandonment, attachment difficulties from childhood on. And it's an interesting thing to note that, for example, like somebody with BPD, if a boyfriend or girlfriend does not return your call or text you right back, then instead of being annoyed and just a little annoyed and carrying on, many people with borderline personality disorder could be, that could lead someone to be very dramatic, very demanding, text a whole bunch, or maybe even decide to self-harm. And a lot of behavioral manifestations of borderline personality disorder are self-destructive, as well as self-harming, including substance abuse, and many dramatic ways of behaving that stem from not being able to manage emotions. So it's really important when thinking about any kind of mental health issue or challenge that involves changes in mood. It's important to be clear that not all depressed states indicate a psychiatric condition. Somebody passes away, or your partner leaves you, or you lose your job, or things happen in life that stress people, that that's known as situational depression. It is appropriate. It is, quote, normal, unquote, for certain circumstances in life, for a time. And these are situations often in which other people would be fairly neutral or even positive or trusting and giving someone the benefit of the doubt. People with borderline personality disorder have difficulty in accurately reading people's emotions and trusting others. And the reason, and that's hard for people to read other people's emotions with BPD, because they're really caught up in their own. And they don't have self-trust or no sense of self, so how are they supposed to trust others? So that's, pretty basic. And there's a difficulty with how people with BPD often perceive others because they aren't so clear on how they're perceiving themselves. A lot of things are projected out from the state that people with this trauma response of borderline personality disorder are really in. And again, I make no excuse for poor behavior. A person with borderline personality disorder, they could tell you something, and you could really feel for them. You could really have empathy for them. And maybe they tell you something really sad. And then, so you share empathy with them, and you're expecting that's the thing to do. That's how you feel. And then all of a sudden, the person with BPD can get really mad at you because they're convinced that your empathy, or you're starting to be really soft and caring, and is somehow mocking them. And why would somebody with BPD think that? Well, maybe that's what they experienced in their childhood. But without this clear and coherent identity and known sense of self, an individual with borderline personality disorder depends on what's happening around them to determine what they feel, what they'll do, who they actually are. As I've often said, they try to live through other people. This is not something they consciously know. To the question, and this is really important here, how is borderline personality disorder treated? Well, here's an absolute fact for you, without doubt, that if you read through the literature, if you read all the professional journal articles, etc., this is one thing they all agree on. There is no medication that successfully treats borderline personality disorder. And in transference-focused psychotherapy, there's an emphasis on the observation and interpretation of a person with BPD's behavior in a relationship with the therapist, or if it's a group program, with other clients in a group program, to be able to identify unrecognized internal states and integrate them into a more coherent sense of self, which goes to inner child work and that as well, which is different than just inner child work that somebody with codependency might do. Bipolar disorder. What is that again? Well, the commonality, in a different way, is that like people with BPD, people with bipolar experience extreme shifts in mood. But this is a key thing, between depressed states and episodes of mania, the bipolar individual may experience periods of stable mood. That's something that doesn't really happen in untreated borderline personality disorder. So someone with bipolar disorder in a depressed state could be totally dejected, feel really hopeless. But if they're in a manic state, they might be up all night writing page after page of a novel or playing music with a sense that they have entered into some kind of special state of genius. And they might speak at a rapidly accelerated pace, which I alluded to before, with actions that are out of sync with appropriate social behavior. For example, disrobing and dancing in a park without being aware that that's inappropriate. A full-blown manic episode shows periods of energy that could go on for days without any relief and would exhaust anybody else. In between the depressed and manic states, people with bipolar have, like as I said, and it's worth reiterating, periods of stable mood. Some bipolar people, or people with bipolar, experience repeated manic states without full-blown manic states. So this is bipolar 2, wherein there can be some hypomania, but not the peak of the actual manic states, alternating with depression. How is bipolar treated? Well, it's treated with medication, often lithium. I don't think it's the only medication of choice. It stabilizes people's moods. And now there are other mood stabilizers that have been developed that they can be, prescribed on a trial and error basis, because each individual with bipolar is different, and so the responses to certain medications might be different as well. And psychotherapy is helpful also to people with bipolar in managing complications that stem from the challenges of having bipolar. So what's the key difference between borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder? Well, when a person has bipolar disorder and is not in a manic or depressive episode, they demonstrate stability that people with borderline personality disorder do not show. So if a person with bipolar disorder is between episodes, they can function pretty well in the world. People with BPD can't just, have a good day and function really well in the world, and then, it just doesn't work that way. They have to have a lot of treatment and learn a lot of things to be able to gradually move toward more functionality. So that's a major difference. People with bipolar can have in-depth relationships that might be disturbed by their, mania or depression, but when they're not experiencing those episodes, they have a stability that you don't see in people with BPD, especially in their relationships. And so bipolar disorder is more rooted, it's believed, I don't know if it's proven, but in the biology of the nervous system and more responsive to medication. Borderline personality strongly involves psychological level of the mind, the way meaning is generated, as well as they think something to do with biology of the brain and the nervous system, but they can't prove that. And then secondarily, I would say with that, in terms of borderline personality disorder, in the recovery process and in recovery from borderline personality disorder, neuroplasticity comes into play, so that even if something is coming from a biological level or in the brain, that can be changed. Bipolar is deemed by experts as a more biological condition with psychological aspects and ways of seeing the world, and borderline personality disorder more as like ways of seeing the world and perceiving the self and others. The mood swings of bipolar disorder are more random and less related to events than those of the borderline. There's another key difference. And people with bipolar disorder might have a hair-triggered kind of response during an episode, whereas a person with BPD has a hair-triggered response, if not all, but most of the time. So key to also note in this is that bipolar goes between essentially two states, depression and mania. Just those two. Or in bipolar 2, I believe it is, depression and hypomania. So with borderline personality disorder, all emotions go up and down, anger, depression, joy, all over the place, and much more rapidly and often. The length of the cycles of these mood changes are also very different from bipolar to people with BPD. Generally, people with borderline moods can last minutes or, minutes or an hour or half a day or a couple of days. But with bipolar, these mood shift changes, depression or mania or hypomania, can last months or even years. And even very rapid cycling bipolar can be distinguished by the other two differences, which is that it's not a triggered change, it's not dependent on any experience in a person's life. And with bipolar, to make it clear, there's no precipitating event to the shift from mania to depression or depression to mania or depression to hypomania. Bipolar on the axis 1 in the DSM, whereas borderline personality disorder is in axis 2 cluster B. So a lot of these quote mistakes unquote or whatever's going on in the diagnosing between BPD and bipolar seems like sometimes maybe somebody wants to diagnose bipolar because they don't really want to write down borderline personality disorder on the chart, or maybe like insurance in the US won't reimburse that, but they'll reimburse for bipolar.